I still remember the exact second my son-in-law leaned toward me, lowered his voice just enough to sound calm, and pointed at the empty chair beside my daughter. It was a nice wooden chair, decorated with a tiny bow tied to the back, nothing too fancy but clearly meant for someone important, someone close, someone loved. He tapped it with his finger like he was flicking dust off something unworthy, and he said in that cold, clipped tone he uses when he wants you to feel small, "You can't sit here." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He looked through me, as if I were a shadow drifting around the room, instead of the father of the woman sitting right there. I swear the entire atmosphere changed, like someone cracked open a window and let in a blast of winter air. One moment the room was buzzing with laughter and chatter and the clinking of glasses, and the next it felt so still you could hear the ice shifting inside the drink someone was holding behind me. My daughter froze, her smile slipping like it had been tugged off her face. Guests who had been mid-conversation paused, turning their heads just enough to listen without looking obvious. And me, a 52-year-old father who's been through more storms than I care to count, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Not anger, not yet. It was something deeper, a kind of tired, aching disappointment that sits behind your ribs and reminds you that no matter how strong you think you are, disrespect has a way of cutting straight to the bone. People assume age makes insults easier to handle. It doesn't. If anything, being older means you've carried enough burdens, enough sacrifices, enough silent battles to know exactly when someone is trying to belittle you. And that day, Ethan, my son-in-law, looked at me the way a bouncer looks at someone holding the wrong ticket. Like I didn't belong. Like I was some outsider who wandered in by mistake. He tapped the chair again, harder this time, forcing me to look directly at it. "Daniel," he said slowly, as if speaking to a child who missed the point the first time, "I said you can't sit here." For a moment I didn't even understand. I thought he was joking, maybe trying to be funny in that awkward, rude way he often tried to impress people. But when I followed his gesture and looked at the long decorated table, the table everyone called the family table, the truth hit me like a slap I never saw coming. Every seat had a neat little name card. His mother's name. His sister's names. His best friend's name. Even two coworkers' names, people I'd never met in my life. And then there was one spot. An empty space. No card. No name. No sign of me. Just a blank spot, as if someone removed a card that didn't belong or deliberately chose not to place one there. I don't think I've ever felt so quietly humiliated in my life. Not the loud kind of humiliation that explodes in front of people, but the silent kind that curls inside your stomach and makes you feel like a stranger in a room full of people who only exist because you worked your hands raw to raise your child into adulthood. Emily, my daughter, looked at me with this expression that broke my heart. She wasn't confused. She wasn't surprised. She looked ashamed. Ashamed that she didn't stop it. Ashamed that she didn't know how to stand up for me without starting an argument with the man she'd married. I saw her swallow back her words, her eyes darting to Ethan as if silently begging him to reconsider. But he wouldn't even meet her gaze. I knew she felt trapped. I knew she felt torn between the husband she chose and the father who raised her. And I didn't want to be the reason she had to choose. So I stood there, pretending I didn't feel anything, pretending I wasn't hurt, pretending I was fine with being told where I could or couldn't sit at an event she invited me to. But pretending only lasts so long. In that moment, I felt every sacrifice I ever made rise up inside me. All the nights I stayed awake when she was sick. All the times I worked 2 jobs so she could have school supplies, dance shoes, or a warm jacket in winter. All the mornings I packed her lunch and told her she could be anything she wanted. All the years I spent being both mother and father. All the birthdays I made special so she never felt the emptiness her mom left behind. And yet here I was, being treated like a guest at my own daughter's table. Scratch that. Not even a guest. A leftover. someone they didn't know where to place. I felt small. I felt invisible. I felt like someone erased me from a picture I spent my whole life drawing. But life is strange. Sometimes the ugliest moments lead to the biggest awakenings. Because 10 minutes after Ethan told me I couldn't sit at that table, 10 minutes after I swallowed the most bitter bite of disrespect I'd tasted in years, something happened that flipped the entire room upside down. People didn't just turn toward me. They didn't just notice me. They stood up for me. Every single person. Not because I demanded it. Not because anyone forced them. Not because they felt sorry for me. But because of one truth, one secret heavy truth that nobody in that room saw coming. Not my daughter, not Ethan, not the guests staring at us with uneasy curiosity, not even the staff who tried to pretend they weren't watching the drama unfold. A truth that revealed exactly who deserved respect. A truth that exposed exactly who had been pretending. A truth that showed the whole room who the real man in that story was. And before I walk you through how that room shifted, how every chair scraped the floor as people rose, how every eye turned from judging me to respecting me, we need to go back. Way back. Back to when Ethan first entered our lives. Back to the promises he made that sounded sweet but had hollow echoes. Back to the early warning signs Emily missed because love makes you blind. Back to the subtle digs, the small gestures, the tiny cracks that eventually grew into fault lines. Because disrespect doesn't explode suddenly. It builds quietly, softly, almost invisibly, until one day, it erupts, loud enough for everyone to hear, sharp enough to cut through every lie. And on that night, it exploded right there in that room, in front of everyone, in a way Ethan never imagined he'd face. This story isn't just about a denied seat. It's about the respect I earned. The respect he tried to take away. The respect the room eventually gave me. And the respect that was mine long before that chair ever existed. And trust me, the moment everything broke open, he never saw it coming.
My name is Daniel Hart, and before that moment, before the exact second my son-in-law told me I couldn't sit beside my own daughter at a family dinner, I truly believed I had finally entered the quiet season of life that men my age hope for. You know the kind I'm talking about, that rare stretch of peace where the world finally stops spinning so fast, where the bills don't choke you, where your bones complain but don't scream, and where your heart finally feels like it can just sit back and breathe. I had spent decades running, worrying, fighting, sacrificing, and suddenly it felt like maybe, just maybe, I had outrun the worst of life's storms. And most of that peace rested on one person, my daughter, Emily. Emily has always been the piece of my life I guarded the hardest. I became a single father when she was just 13. Her mother, my wife, died after a long illness, and overnight I went from being the fun parent to being the only parent. Those were the kind of years that carved themselves into your bones. I worked early mornings delivering packages, late nights repairing whatever broken thing someone would pay me to fix, and somehow tried to be both mother and father at the same time. People talk about single parenting like it's some noble, beautiful journey. It's not. It's survival. It's waking up exhausted, going to bed exhausted, and hopping you did enough in between that your kid doesn't fall apart. I didn't have the luxury of hobbies or plans or dreams. My dream became getting Emily through school. My hobby was figuring out how to stretch one paycheck into 2 lives. My vacation was sitting on the couch with her, sharing a cheap pizza and pretending everything was okay. But Emily, she made it worth it. Even after losing her mom, she grew into someone gentle, focused, driven. She was the kind of kid who'd do her homework without being asked, who'd work part-time after school but still manage straight A's, who looked at me with this expression that said, "Dad, don't worry, I'll make you proud." And she did. She got accepted into nursing school. She took her future into her own hands. She fought for it. And then one day, she told me she met someone. Ethan. When she said his name, she had that look, the kind that tells you your kid's heart is already tied up in someone, whether you like it or not. I tried to be supportive, tried to keep my guard down. But the first time I met Ethan, something in my gut tightened. He wasn't rude, not exactly. He wasn't mean. He was polished, too polished. He had that shiny confidence people wear when they want to impress everyone in the room, the kind of confidence that feels more like costume jewelry than the real thing. He shook my hand like he was evaluating me. He spoke like a man who wanted the room to echo his words. He complimented my home in that backhanded way rich-seeming people do, saying things like, "It's really cozy," with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But Emily liked him. And I didn't want to be the stereotype, the overprotective single dad, the guy who thinks no man is good enough for his daughter. I told myself to give him a chance. I reminded myself that first impressions can be wrong. But over time, the little things started piling up. Like the way he interrupted Emily mid-sentence if what she said didn't match his train of thought. The way he rolled his eyes when she talked about long hours at the hospital. The way he bragged about his high-value lifestyle while conveniently leaving out the part where he was still living in his mother's basement when they started dating. He talked like a man building a brand, not a life. And yet, Emily didn't see it. Or maybe she didn't want to. Love makes people blind, but it also makes them hopeful. I kept reminding myself that I was seeing him through a father's eyes, eyes that had spent years protecting her from every scratch and heartbreak. When they got engaged, I swallowed every worry and congratulated them. I told myself this was Emily's life, not mine, that my job wasn't to choose for her but to support her. So I helped them move into their first apartment. I fixed the broken cabinet doors. I unclogged a drain that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since 1998. I helped them when their bills were tight, even though mine weren't exactly wide. Ethan always accepted the help, always with that stiff, reluctant thanks that sounded like he'd swallowed vinegar before saying it. I don't think he ever once said it without looking over my shoulder, like he didn't want Emily to see that he needed me. And still I stayed quiet. I told myself, if Emily is happy, my opinion doesn't matter. But the truth is, I was ignoring all the signs. Signs that the respect I thought existed between us was paper-thin. Signs that Ethan never really saw me as family. Signs that he thought he was above me. That my daughter marrying him meant she was stepping up and leaving me behind. I didn't realize it then. I didn't understand how fragile everything really was. But here's something life teaches you late, when you think you've already learned it all. Happiness built on disrespect doesn't last. It cracks, it crumbles, and when it collapses, it makes a noise loud enough to wake everyone who was pretending not to hear. And the day it happened, the day Ethan dared to tell me I couldn't sit beside my own child, that was the day everything snapped. That was the moment the storm I thought I'd outrun finally caught up to me.
The first real crack didn't come with shouting or accusations or anything dramatic enough to warn me what was coming. It came quietly, like most cracks do, slipping into the moment so softly that if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it. But I didn't miss it. I felt it. I felt it in my chest, in a place no one could see, but everyone seemed perfectly comfortable stepping on. It happened during their holiday dinner last year, one of those evenings that's supposed to make a family feel warm, united, grateful. The house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon and fresh bread. Emily had gone all out, just like her mom used to. She always did this thing where she'd set the table 2 hours early, triple-check the napkins, and put little handwritten place cards even though it was just close family. It was her way of showing love, of proving she could create a home as beautiful and comforting as the one she lost too young. I arrived early like I always did, not because she asked but because I knew her. She took on more than any one person should. She wanted every dish to be perfect, every corner spotless, every detail just right. It reminded me so much of her mother that sometimes I had to step into the hallway to breathe. So I always came early, rolled up my sleeves, and helped without being asked. When Ethan's family arrived, the air shifted. They walked in like inspectors sent to evaluate the place. His mother's perfume hit first, strong, cold, expensive. She had that way of looking around a room that made you feel like your belongings were auditioning for approval. His two sisters looked like they'd stepped straight out of some catalog, all sharp cheekbones and practiced smiles. His brother-in-law talked loud about stocks the moment he crossed the threshold. It wasn't that they were rude. It was that they were the kind of people who believe they don't need to be rude to show you they're superior. Their silence, their raised eyebrows, their too smooth expressions did all the talking for them. I greeted them, I really tried. I shook hands, offered smiles, tried to be welcoming. And in return, I got that familiar, polite but judgmental smile. The one you recognize instantly if you've ever worked with your hands, ever lived paycheck to paycheck, ever learned the value of things through effort instead of inheritance. It was a smile that said, "You're not like us." But it was dressed up enough to pretend it meant nothing. I brushed it off. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't come for them. I came for Emily. Dinner started well enough. The food was good. Emily was glowing, proud of her cooking, proud of her home. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the peace I thought I'd earned. But then Ethan opened his mouth and the crack appeared. He raised his glass and said, with that arrogant smirk he wore like a second skin, "You know, Emily works so hard. She definitely gets that work ethic from me." The table erupted in laughter, loud, dramatic, the kind that people use to prove they're amused even when the joke isn't funny. Everyone laughed, except two people, Emily and me. She looked down at her plate, her smile tightening in that way she had when she was hurt but didn't want anyone to know. And I just sat there, feeling the heat crawl up my neck. Because everyone at that table knew exactly who raised her, who carried her through every heartbreak, who worked multiple jobs, who skipped meals so she wouldn't, who showed up to every parent-teacher meeting, every recital, every exam, every setback and success. They knew. But in that room, Ethan wanted the credit. He wanted the spotlight. He wanted to show his family that Emily was great because of him, not because of anything that came before. I swallowed it. I let it slide. I reminded myself it was her night, her effort, her holiday. The last thing I wanted was to ruin it. But the universe doesn't let lessons come gently, not when people like Ethan are in the picture. Later that night, Emily mentioned something small about her childhood, something innocent and sweet, a memory we shared. I don't even remember what it was now because what came after burned it out of my mind. She said something like, "Dad always used to," and before she could finish, Ethan cut in. He didn't just interrupt her, he dismissed her. Yeah, he said, "but that's in the past. She's part of a new family now, a better one." A better one. That word better didn't just land, it sank. It punched straight into me like someone had shoved a fist into my chest. I felt the weight of it spreading through me, heavy and cold. I looked at Emily and in her expression I saw something I didn't like. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shock. It was fear. Fear of choosing sides, fear of confrontation, fear of disrupting the peace she wanted so badly to maintain. I stayed silent. Not because I lacked courage, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I spoke, if I let myself react, that night would explode. Everything Emily had worked so hard to put together would fall apart. So I let myself be the villain of the room's unspoken hierarchy. I let myself be eclipsed. And the worst part was I could feel Ethan's satisfaction, subtle but there, like he'd scored a point, like he'd established something. But what I didn't realize then was that this moment, this tiny venom-laced exchange wasn't going to fade. It was going to grow, drop by drop, crack by crack, because disrespect is like mold. If you don't scrub it out the second it appears, it spreads. It spreads silently, underneath everything, until one day it erupts and you're left wondering how something so small became something big enough to break you. That night, sitting at a table full of people who thought they were better than me, I realized something I had been avoiding for months. I had been gentle for too long. And people who are used to taking advantage of gentle men eventually forget they're choosing to be gentle, not that they're incapable of anything else. But I still didn't know then just how deep that crack would go, or how fast it would spread, or how ugly things would get before the truth finally surfaced.
For months leading up to that night, months full of Ethan's bragging, flexing, boasting about his so-called career growth, I kept my mouth shut. I listened to his stories about becoming a regional director, a title he loved saying like it made him royalty. He'd toss it around in every conversation, rolling it off his tongue like it was gold-plated. He bragged about how he was now too busy for certain tasks, how he was earning serious money now, how his co-workers looked up to him, how he was running the place. It was like listening to a man audition for a movie role he didn't qualify for. Everyone around him laughed and clapped and admired him like he'd climbed Mount Everest with his bare hands. His family soaked it up like gospel. Emily, blessed her big hearts, believed him with full trust. She'd tell me, "Dad, Ethan's working so hard. He's really proving himself." And I would nod, smile, keep quiet. Not because I believed him, but because I loved her too much to ruin her picture of a perfect future. But the truth had been sitting in my lap for months, and Ethan had no idea. Because here's the part, he never bothered to learn about me, not in all the years he'd known me. Not in all the times he'd shaken my hand with that fake respect. Not in all the dinners where he pretended I was invisible. I worked part-time for the same corporation, not his building, not his team, not his department, but the same big company. And he never once asked me what I did or where I worked. He talked so much about himself, he never even considered the possibility that I might know something he didn't want me to know. He thought I was just some old handyman from a lower world, someone who did odd jobs, someone who couldn't possibly understand corporate life. He treated me like a footnote in Emily's life, not a man with his own story, but that ignorance, that arrogance, that assumption he held on to. That's what came back to bite him, because 1 month before that dinner, 1 month before, he told me I wasn't allowed to sit beside my own daughter, found out the truth about his promotion. And when I say truth, I mean the kind that doesn't just crack a light, crushes it like a soda can under a boot. He didn't get promoted. He didn't move up. He didn't earn a regional director position. Hell, there wasn't even such a role available in his division. What actually happened was the exact opposite. He got demoted, not softly, not quietly, not with dignity. Got pushed down the ladder so fast that it probably rattled his teeth. And it wasn't a temporary shuffle or a restructuring, or some corporate reshuffling excuse he could use to save face. No, this was the kind of demotion that comes with a warning stapled to it. The company had put him on what's called a PIPA, performance improvement plan. If you've never heard of it, let me explain it in simple words. It's the corporate version of your one mistake away from packing your desk. They only give it to employees who are failing, who can't keep up, who are causing problems. And the truth is, everyone in his department knew it. Supervisors, managers, assistants. His reputation was not what he pretended it was. He wasn't some rising star. He wasn't some leader in the making. He wasn't admired. He was a burden, an issue, a man they'd already decided to replace if he couldn't fix his mess in 30 days. And the promotion dinner, The one he made Emily plan. The one he'd bragged about for weeks. The one he decorated the hall for, invited his extended family to, told everyone he wanted to celebrate the next chapter at. It was all fake, every bit of it. The centerpieces, the reserved tables, the speeches he hinted about. The fancy suit he bought on credit. It wasn't a celebration, it was camouflage, a performance, a desperate attempt to hide the fact that he was failing at the job he pretended to be a star in. He was losing control of his life. So he tried to stage a scene where he looked powerful, admired, respected. And he wanted that admiration so badly that he didn't mind lying straight to Emily's face. He didn't mind forcing her to cook for hours, plan everything, spend money they didn't have. He didn't mind letting her defend him to others. He didn't mind dragging her into his fantasy world. He was building a castle made of lies, and placing my daughter right inside it, and I watched it all quietly from the background, knowing more than he thought, knowing his world was built on sand. Did I want to expose him immediately? No, I didn't want to break Emily's heart. I didn't want to humiliate her in front of strangers. Didn't want her to feel foolish for believing in the man she chose. But when he stood in front of me that night, when he blocked my path, when he pointed to that chair like he owned the room, when he told me, "You can't sit here," like I wasn't family, like I was beneath him, like I wasn't worth the seat at my own daughter's side, something in me broke open, something old, something primal, something forged from years of sacrifice, years of hard work, years of swallowing disrespect to keep the peace. Every insult I had ever endured in silence, every time someone looked down at me, every time I pushed aside my pride to make life easier for someone else, every night I worked late so Emily could have a better tomorrow, every birthday I made special for her, every tear I wiped from her cheek. Every moment I stood alone as both parents. All of it rose up inside me like a storm, and right then I realized something every man learns eventually. Respect is not something you beg for. Respect is not something you wait for. Respect is not given by people who have none inside them. Respect is something you claim when the moment calls for it. And that night when he tried to erase me from my own daughter's life, that moment arrived. The truth was coming. The lies were about to crack open. The room had no idea what was about to hit them. And Ethan, he was standing on a cliff he didn't even know he built with his own hands, because the secret was out, and the explosion was only minutes away.
The moment those words left my mouth, the entire room seemed to freeze in a strange kind of stillness. The kind that happens right before a storm break. Every single person sitting at that decorated table, the ones who had been laughing so loud just minutes ago, suddenly looked like they were holding their breath, as if they couldn't decide whether to look at me, at Ethan, or at the paper dangling from my fingers, like a blade ready to drop. And in that silence, I could hear everything. The clink of someone nervously setting down their glass. The faint scratch of a chair being dragged back. The soft, shaky inhale from Emily, who looked torn between disbelief and heartbreak as her eyes flicked between the man she married and the father who would never once lied to her in his entire life. Ethan's face drained of color so quickly, it was like watching ink wash off paper. Every ounce of confidence he strutted in with evaporated, leaving him standing there, exposed, stripped of the image he tried so desperately to build. I could see him searching for something to say, some joke to break the tension, some smart remark to regain control. But his lips just twitched like a man drowning who couldn't find even a piece of wood to hold on to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I didn't insult him. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. I let the silence sit for a long moment as everybody drank it in, letting the weight of the lie settle on their shoulders, because these weren't small lies. These were the kind that climb into a marriage, into a family, into the cracks between trust and love, and slowly pry them wider until nothing fits anymore. I turned slightly and looked at Emily, her hands trembling in her lap, her mascara barely holding, her whole body leaning forward like she wanted to run toward me and away from him at the same time, and that broke something in me. Not anger, not pride, something deeper. The kind of hurt a father feels when he sees his daughter realizing she gave her life, her heart, her home, to a man who treated honesty like an optional accessory. Ethan tried stepping toward me then, voice shaking as he hissed, "Daniel, that's enough." But his attempt at authority only made the room quieter, heavier, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. I held up the paper again, not waving it, just presenting it as calmly as a judge presenting a verdict. "This isn't my opinion," I said, my voice steady. "This is your company's official notice. The same one you tried to hide while throwing a party with money you don't have and pride you didn't earn." His brother-in-law shifted uncomfortably, whispering to the sister who always treated me like an inconvenience. The mother-in-law who looked at me with smug superiority at every event now stared at Ethan with her mouth slightly open as if trying to compute where everything went wrong. And I could see the moment she realized her son wasn't the man she believed him to be. The host who had introduced Ethan earlier stood frozen with an awkward smile plastered on his face, holding the mic like it might explode. I took a breath, letting my tone soften, but not my truth. Because there's a difference between cruelty and clarity. And I wasn't there to humiliate him. I was there to end the humiliation he'd thrown onto me and my daughter. "Emily," I said gently, turning my head toward her, "I raised you to value truth more than decoration. I raised you to know that real love doesn't hide behind fake titles and borrowed pride. I didn't want to say anything tonight, but I won't watch you build your future on someone else's lies." Her lips quivered, and I could see the moment her heart cracked, not because of me, but because of the man she thought she knew. Ethan finally snapped then, grabbing the edge of the table so hard a glass toppled and shattered across the floor, the sound ringing through the hall like a gunshot. But even that didn't give him the power he was desperate to reclaim. He muttered something under his breath. Something like, "This isn't how family behaves." And I turned back to him, slowly, steadily, letting the weight of every year I spent being mother and father to Emily tighten my spine as I replied, "Family doesn't lie to each other. Family doesn't hide the truth behind fancy decorations. Family doesn't push the people who raised your wife to the back of the room like they're an embarrassment." My voice rose not in anger, but in certainty, and the room hung on every syllable because they could feel it. The truth in it, the years behind it, the love anchoring it. Ethan shook his head desperately, sweat forming on his forehead as his carefully crafted image shattered in front of co-workers who had once admired him, in front of his own family who now saw him not as the golden son but as a frightened boy caught in his own net. But it didn't matter anymore, not to me, not to the guests, not even to Emily. The truth was out. And once spoken, truth never walks back into silence. It fills the room, fills the air, fills the space between people until everyone has to face it. And that night, The truth finally found its place. The silence after I handed the mic back was the kind that feels alive. The kind that stretches across the room and wraps itself around every person sitting there, making them feel the weight of what just happened. And for a second, no one moved. No one even breathed too loudly. As if the whole room was afraid to disrupt the truth that had finally been laid bare in front of them. I didn't look at Ethan right away. Instead, I looked down at my hands that had worked honest jobs. Hands that held my daughter on nights she cried over homework or heartbreak. Hands that fixed things around her home when Ethan was too busy pretending to be someone important. Then I raised my head, looked at the man who had spent months parading his false pride like a trophy, and I spoke quietly, with a calmness that cut deeper than yelling ever could. Son, if you'd respected me, I would have kept your secret. But disrespect digs its own grave. And the moment I said that, I felt something shift, not anger, not satisfaction, but a deep, grounded certainty that for the first time in a very long time, the line had been drawn, the boundary had been placed, and it was no longer me who had to carry the weight of bending just to keep the peace. I handed the microphone back to the host, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and stepped aside so the spotlight could fall wherever truth wanted it to land. Ethan didn't move. His eyes were darting around, searching for someone, anyone to defend him, to say something, to give him back even a sliver of control. But the room was too quiet, too aware, too awakened to the man he truly was. Then it happened, slow at first. Like a wave building its strength before crashing, Molly stood up. She didn't speak, didn't look at Ethan, didn't hesitate. She stood with the kind of purpose that only comes when a person sees their world clearly for the first time. And when she rose, there was something in her expression that broke my heart. A little, not sadness, not confusion, but recognition. Recognition of the lies. Recognition of who truly protected her. Recognition of the difference between love and manipulation. Her chair made the faintest scraping sound on the floor, and that single sound seemed to wake the room up, because seconds later, Ethan's co-workers stood too. Men and women who had come expecting to celebrate him, who had toasted him hours earlier. Now, rising silently in an odd mixture of respect and disappointment, not for Ethan, but for the truth they had just witnessed. It wasn't the enthusiastic kind of standing you see in celebrations. It was the solemn kind you see when people acknowledge something real, something raw, something that deserves to be honored. And then, the final blow to Ethan's pride. His own family stood. His mother, the one who always lifted her chin slightly higher when speaking around me, as if money or appearances made her superior, now rose with trembling hands, her eyes shifting between her son and the document that exposed him. His sisters followed, slower, their smug expressions replaced with something far more fragile: shame. Even his brother-in-law Hood walked in earlier, talking loudly about business investments. He didn't understand, stood up, avoiding Ethan's eyes like standing beside him might stain his reputation. One by one, the room rose in a quiet, powerful wave that had nothing to do with applause and everything to do with respect. Respect, not for dominance or status, but for honesty, for dignity, for the kind of integrity that doesn't need a spotlight to shine. I felt the weight of every year I spent raising Emily alone settle into my chest. But this time, it didn't feel heavy, it felt seen. Emily walked directly to me, her heels tapping against the wooden floor with a certainty I had never seen in her before. When she reached me, she didn't say a big dramatic speech. She didn't call out Ethan in front of everyone. She simply wrapped her arms around me, burying her face into my shoulder, the same way she used to when she was little and scared of thunderstorms. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Dad, I'm so sorry." And in that moment, everything inside me softened: the anger, the disappointment, the humiliation from earlier. All of it melted, because the only thing that mattered was that my daughter finally saw the truth. I hugged her back, holding her like the little girl she once was and the strong woman she had become. And the room stayed standing, stayed silent, stayed watching, because they knew they were witnessing a break not between me and Ethan, but between truth and lies. And when Emily finally pulled back and turned toward the tables, the entire hall saw Ethan slump into his chair, his elbows on the table, his hands covering his face like a man whose life had been unplugged from the illusion he had built. The same man who told me, "You can't sit here," now couldn't find a single seat in the room that didn't burn with shame. The man who once puffed his chest and bragged about titles that weren't his, now sat smaller than I'd ever seen him, shrinking under the weight of his own deception. His shoulders trembled, not from anger, but from the cold realization that the world he crafted out of lies had collapsed right in front of the people he most wanted to impress. And for the first time since I had met him, he finally understood what respect really cost and why he had never earned it. When the event finally ended, and it ended far earlier than anyone planned, the room emptied with the kind of hush that follows a storm, the kind where people walk out quietly, glancing over their shoulders, processing what they witnessed. The decorations still hung from the walls, the food trays still sat untouched on the tables, the lights were still warm and bright, but the celebration was gone. What remained was the echo of truth, lingering like smoke after a fire. I watched people avoid Ethan's gaze as they slipped their jackets on, murmuring in low voices, some shaking their heads, others whispering to each other with that soft tone you use when you've seen something you know will be talked about for weeks. Ethan stayed seated, shoulders curled in, staring at nothing, like a man who finally saw the reflection he'd been avoiding. Emily walked toward me slowly, her hands shaking. She didn't try to say anything there, not in front of the guests, not with Ethan watching her through the cracks of his fingers. She simply reached for my arm, squeezed it gently, and whispered, "Let's go home, Dad." There was something in her voice, something soft, fragile, almost childlike, that made my heart ache in a way that words can't describe. She hadn't sounded like that in years. Not since she was a scared teenager trying to understand life without her mother. And just like then, I placed a steady hand on her back, getting her out of the hall with the quiet certainty that no matter how old she got, I would always be the place she could return to when the world became too heavy. And we stepped outside. The night air was cold, but not the kind of cold that stings, more like the kind that brings clarity. Emily held her purse close to her chest, her eyes red but dry, like she was balancing between breaking down and holding herself upright. We didn't say much on the drive home. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. Every now and then, I saw her wipe a tear with the back of her hand, quick and discreet, the way people do when they're trying not to fall apart. But I didn't push, I didn't ask, I didn't rush her into a conversation she wasn't ready to have. I simply drove, with both hands on the wheel, keeping the car steady the way I used to keep our lives steady when everything around us felt uncertain. When we got home, she followed me inside, walked straight to the living room, and before I could even ask if she wanted tea or water or anything, she collapsed onto the couch and finally let it all out. Years of frustration, months of doubt, weeks of ignoring the signs that her marriage was built on the surface-level charm of a man who cared more about how things looked than how things truly were. She cried with that deep shaking sadness that comes when a dream dies, not because someone stole it, but because you finally accept it was never real. I sat beside her, not saying a word, just letting her lean on my shoulder like she used to when she was little. And in that moment, I saw my daughter, not the wife, not the grown woman, not the adult making hard decisions, but the little girl I raised, who always tried to be strong until she couldn't pretend anymore. She stayed the night. She didn't go home to Ethan. didn't answer his calls, didn't respond to the long messages that kept buzzing her phone like a relentless reminder of everything she was trying to process. The next morning, after a quiet breakfast where she barely touched her food, she took a deep breath and said, "I need to talk to him." Not with anger, not with rage, just exhausted truth. We drove to her apartment, and this time she asked me to stay in the car. I respected that. She walked inside with steady steps, shoulders straight, but I could see the tension in her jaw from where I sat. The confrontation didn't last long. I saw part of it through the window, not because I wanted to spy, but because the voices carried. Ethan started angry, loud, defensive, flailing excuses like weapons he didn't know how to use. He pointed fingers everywhere except at himself, at me for exposing him, at his coworkers for embarrassing him, at the company for setting him up, at Emily for not standing by him when he needed her. He kept repeating the same line over and over, "You weren't supportive enough." As if support meant covering lies. As if love meant shielding him from the consequences he created. As if marriage meant applauding deceit as long as it looked impressive from the outside. Emily didn't shout back. She didn't cry. She didn't crumble. She stood there, calm, composed, seeing him clearly for the first time without the fog of affection clouding her judgment. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't waver. It was soft but steady. The kind of voice a person uses when they've made up their mind long before the conversation began. He tried to interrupt, but she didn't let him this time. She told him she couldn't stay married to a man who treated her father with disrespect. She told him trust meant more than titles. She told him honesty was worth more than performance. She told him love couldn't survive on illusions. And the moment she said those words, I saw Ethan's face change. Not into regret, not into remorse, but into blame. He blamed the entire world for the collapse happening in front of him, except the one person responsible, himself. It didn't take long after that. She packed her essential things. She walked out the front door. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She got into the car beside me, closed the door softly, and whispered, "I'm done." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of months, maybe even years of disappointment. They separated 2 weeks later. The paperwork was quiet and clean. No fights, no begging, no threats. Just a cold, simple ending to a marriage that had begun with promises, but was held together by lies. And in the end, it wasn't my speech that destroyed anything. It wasn't my reveal. It wasn't even my presence. Sometimes a man destroys his own life and blames the mirror for showing the cracks. Emily moved back in with me for a few months, and those months felt like life had come full circle, like the universe took all the chaos, all the tension, all the painful silence she'd been living in, and replaced it with something simple, honest, and peaceful. My house isn't big. It's an older place with squeaky floorboards, a living room that always smells faintly of fresh coffee, and a backyard where the grass never grows evenly no matter how many times I mow it. But it was home. And for the first time in a long time, I watched my daughter walk through the front door, not as Ethan's wife, not as someone carrying the heavy load of a failing marriage, but as my little girl again, the same one who used to come running into my arms after school, with her backpack sliding off her shoulders. Her first week back, she barely went anywhere. She slept a lot. She sat in the living room in her pajamas, wrapped in one of the old blankets her mom knitted before she passed. I'd hear her sigh sometimes, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind people make when they're finally letting out breath they've held for years. We didn't talk much at first. Healing doesn't start with conversations. It starts with space. It starts with safety. It starts with simply being able to sit in your own skin again, without feeling judged or controlled or manipulated. I'd cook breakfast in the mornings, usually scrambled eggs, nothing fancy, and she'd wander into the kitchen with messy hair, rubbing her eyes like she used to when she was a kid. Sometimes she'd sit with me and eat, sometimes she'd just sip a coffee and stare out the window. And every day, little by little, I watched the weight she carried shrink, like snow melting off a roof when spring starts creeping in. By the second week, we started taking walks after dinner. Nothing big, just around the neighborhood. The evenings were cool, the air gentle, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional dog barking or someone pulling into their driveway. Emily would hook her arm around mine, the same way she did when she was a teenager, and we'd talk about the smallest things, what we saw on our walks, the flowers blooming in someone's yard, the memories that popped up when we passed the old community center. She laughed more during those walks than I'd heard her laugh in the last year. Real laughter. The kind that relaxes your shoulders and brightens your eyes. The kind you don't fake for anyone. And one night, halfway through our usual loop, she stopped walking. She just stood there under a street lamp, looking at the sidewalk like she was trying to see something buried under it. I turned to her, ready to ask if she was okay, but she spoke first. Her voice was soft, fragile but steady. "Dad, I thought I outgrew needing you." It hit me like a wave, gentle but overwhelming. I didn't interrupt. I didn't touch her. I just listened. She swallowed, blinking back tears, and said, "I really believed that being an adult meant doing everything alone, handling things alone, enduring things alone. But you've always been the only steady person in my life, and I didn't even realize how much I missed that until I came back here." Her words cracked something open inside me, not in a painful way, but in a way that reminded me why every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night, every extra shift, every scraped-together meal, every setback I pushed through was worth it, because it led to moments like that one. Moments where your child, grown, independent, carrying their own scars, looks at you not with pity or obligation, but with gratitude. Her healing wasn't quick. Healing never is. She started therapy a few weeks later. She found a counselor who helped her unpack the layers of control, dismissal, and emotional exhaustion she'd been living under. Twice a week, she'd come home from her sessions looking lighter, as if some invisible rope around her chest had been loosened. She began journaling. She started reading again, something she stopped doing when she married Ethan. She signed up for extra shifts at work, not because she needed the money, but because she felt capable again, strong again, herself again. Slowly, she stopped checking her phone every few minutes. She stopped waiting for apologies that never came. She stopped blaming herself for choosing a man who loved attention more than partnership. And one night, while we were washing dishes together, me rinsing, her drying, she said something that felt like the final turning point. "Dad, I'm not broken. I just forgot who I was for a while." And she was right. She wasn't broken. She was healing, growing, remembering, reclaiming. Those months brought us closer than we had been in years. We cooked dinner together like old days, nothing fancy, mostly comfort food, but somehow the meals tasted better. We laughed at stupid jokes we had no business laughing at. We watched old movies her mom used to love. We sat on the porch and talked about the future, her dreams, her goals, her plans to find herself again. She became stronger, wiser, and softer at the same time. It was like watching her rebuild a house from the inside out. Solid foundation, new walls, open windows, sunlight everywhere. And for me, the moment she told me I'd always been the steady person in her life, that was the real reward. Not the applause at the event, not the standing ovation, not the moment everyone chose respect over superficial showmanship. Those were temporary, those were loud. But this quiet closeness, this renewed trust, this gentle healing, this was permanent. This was everything. This was the kind of victory a father holds close to his heart long after the world stops talking about what happened. I never woke up that morning with the intention of exposing anyone, tearing apart a celebration, or stepping into the center of a moment that wasn't mine. I didn't dress up with the thought of delivering a lesson or becoming some kind of symbol. All I wanted, simple, innocent, and painfully human, was to sit beside my daughter at an event she was proud of. I wanted to share her smile when the lights dimmed, I wanted to clap when she clapped, and I wanted to be present the way a father should be when his child says, "Come with me, Dad, I want you there." But life has a way of taking the most ordinary hopes and throwing them into unexpected storms, especially when pride and insecurity stand in the same room. The night taught me something I thought I already knew, but apparently needed to see in action once more. People who build their confidence on lies fear the truth more than anything else. They walk into rooms hoping no one notices the cracks in their image, the gaps between their words and their actions, the shadows behind their smiles. They speak loudly, dress sharply, and rehearse the kind of charm they think can cover what they don't want anyone to see. Ethan was exactly that, a man desperate to be admired, desperate to be applauded, desperate to be seen as something bigger, shinier, more important than the man he was when no one was watching. His entire identity depended on how people looked at him. But the thing about respect is this. Real respect doesn't need to be earned through performances or parties or titles printed on invitations. It doesn't come from ordering someone to sit at the back of a room. Respect isn't tied to a chair, a table, a badge, or spotlight. Respect comes from character, from humility, from honesty, from how you treat people when there's nothing for you to gain and no one watching to judge you. And when someone strips you of it publicly, it often reveals one truth: they never had any in the first place. I didn't take the microphone to destroy his reputation. I didn't open that envelope because I wanted applause. In fact, when the room stood for me, I didn't even feel triumphant. I felt still, quiet, like life had paused long enough to show everyone something simple. Dignity doesn't need decoration. It speaks for itself. And when people recognize it, really recognize it, they stand not because they're told to, but because something in their hearts tells them they should. Ethan tried so hard to make himself the main character of that evening that he never noticed the story shifting around him. He didn't understand that when you push someone to the back without reason, life has a strange way of putting them exactly where they deserve to be, front and center, but only when they've earned it. And the irony, the very thing he tried to hide, the very truth he hoped to bury under lights and speeches, was the thing that pulled every layer of his facade apart. I'm not a perfect man. I'm not wealthy. I'm not powerful. I'm not someone who commands rooms with flair or speeches or charisma. I'm a father, a tired, agging father who worked too many hours, sacrificed too many dreams, and gave too much of himself to raise a daughter on his own. I've had moments where the world made me feel small. I've sat at the back plenty of times, quietly, willingly, sometimes because life pushed me there, sometimes because I didn't know I deserved better. But I've never needed to pretend to be more than I am, and that's the difference. If there's one thing I learned that night, and one thing I want every parent, every quiet soul, every underestimated person to understand, it's this: the love you pour into your child, the strength you carry alone, the scars you hide so they don't worry, the nights you stay awake because you don't want them to feel unsafe, all of that becomes your legacy. It may go unnoticed for years. It may go unthanked for decades. You may walk into rooms where people think you're invisible. But one day, every sacrifice whispers louder than every person who tried to silence your worth. And that is when the world sees you. Not because you demanded it. Not because you forced it. Not because you staged a celebration or wore a title. But because truth, real truth, has a way of shining even when no one wants it to. That night, Ethan tried to push me out of the picture, but he didn't understand that respect isn't furniture you assign. It isn't a seat you grant or take away. It isn't something you control by telling someone where to sit or stand. Respect is a reflection of the choices you make, the honesty you live with, and the way you treat people when you think no one is paying attention. And that night, the truth didn't just expose him. It taught everyone in that room a lesson without needing a single dramatic line. My daughter saw it, her co-workers saw it, his own family saw it. Respect isn't about proximity to a stage. Respect is about proximity to integrity. And on that night, the quietest, simplest man in the room ended up being the one people stood for. So if you're a parent, especially one who raised a child alone, who felt the weight of two roles, who carried every responsibility without asking for applause, remember this: you don't need a spotlight, you don't need a title, you don't need validation from people who don't understand your journey, because the love you gave your child, the strength you carried when no one thanked you, the years you put in without anyone noticing, those things build a foundation no lie can shake. And one day, maybe in a room full of strangers, maybe in a moment you never expected, the truth of who you are will speak louder than anyone who ever tried to diminish you. Sometimes the whole room stands to hear it.